Hey everybody. So I wanted to take a quick look at some of the main issues from Chapter 12, Low Incidence Disabilities. I decided to make this a video and we'll talk about Chapter 11 in class because there's a couple of just real main theoretical differences in some of the terminology in this chapter that I wanted to go over specifically. But other than that, this chapter is really guided on some general principles, and I figure we can cover this in a relatively short and expedited video. So as I said, the chapter is going to cover low incidence disabilities. We cover severe, profound, and multiple disabilities. And each of those are different specific legal terms, and they do have very distinct meanings, especially multiple. So we can start first with the idea of multiple disabilities. In general, a person who would be classified as having multiple disabilities would be found eligible for IDEA services for more than one of the 13 available categories. Okay, so that could be having an intellectual disability with autism. That could be having a learning disability with ADHD, which would be considered other health impairments. That could be having a visual impairment and having a hearing impairment. Sometimes this is called deaf-blind. We'll talk about that in a second. So at any rate, it's any two or more of the standard disability categories put together. Now, when we talk about severe disabilities, it's not actually a thing. It's more of a concept, okay? So remember that disabilities occur on a spectrum from very, very minor to extremely, extremely severe and profound. Severe is on the more intense end of that particular spectrum. For example, if you look at like the terror, warning system. It starts with blue, green, yellow, orange, red. So we could consider severe more in that orangish kind of a color, where it is quite intense of a degree of a disability. Now, so when we're talking about severe disabilities, we usually refer to more cognitive related or information processing related disabilities. For example, you'll hear severe intellectual disability, severe learning disability, severe autism, a severe emotional behavioral related disability. You usually don't hear the words like severe hearing loss, severe blindness. And we'll talk about that in a second. We usually save the words profound for that. Okay, so when you think of severe, usually it's going to be to those categories. Now, like I said, profound is another degree of intensity, and we use them for both cognitive and processing and physical disabilities. It would be the highest degree of intensity. It would be that red, right? And, the 5 alarm, the absolute highest degree of intensity. In practical usage, we use that for things like hearing, vision, and mobility. But we also use profound for things like intellectual disabilities. We looked at the IQ charts many chapters ago, and you can see that we have categories for profound intellectual disability built within the eligibility definition. But you'd say it's profoundly blind, profoundly deaf, and you've heard both of those terms used already in this class. But just in general, for the either cognitive or for the information processing related disabilities, people with profound mental disabilities are going to have functioning of no greater than about 2 years of functioning. So that's a very clear, profound deficit between where a person can perform and where a person is functioning currently. Now, deaf-blind along the lines with multiple disabilities. Deaf-blind is a very small but still recognized category where a person is legally considered both deaf and blind, okay, according to the legal definitions and the educational definitions, whereas the educational definitions where a student's issue with hearing, okay, impacts their academic performance. And same thing with vision. Yeah, we do have numbers for vision, the 20/70 and 2200 range, but as far as ID is concerned, if a person's eyesight is causing a impact to their academic performance, we could consider that a disabling condition. So it's the combination of both the hearing impairment and the vision impairment. Now, traumatic brain injury is another low incidence, which means it doesn't happen very often, related disability. And a special thing about TBI is that TBIs are acquired. And remember that acquired disabilities are different than congenital disabilities. Congenital means at birth, and acquired means that it happens at some point during life. We also have an exclusion criteria in intellectual disabilities, whereas we say that intellectual disabilities need to manifest in the developmental period. That's the legal terminology, whereas it happens, at birth or very, very early on. Whereas TBI is something that's always acquired, and oftentimes it happens later on. It can happen in a number of ways. Most of the time it's through accident, but sometimes it can be through certain major health problems. I mean, even things like meningitis can leave the brain injured because of the swelling and the pushing against the cranium, like the skull, and that can cause damage. That can affect the ability for the brain to function. And it doesn't have to be the whole brain. Oftentimes it's not the whole brain, but if there's damage to a specific part, remember that the brain controls specific parts of our functioning through different actual geographic areas of the brain. So if it's the occipital lobe is towards the back, so if a person gets a brain injury towards the back, that could affect that particular area, but not necessarily affect the frontal cortex, which is in the front of the brain. That has to do with decision making and right, wrong, and empathizing and things like that. So like I said, TBI can happen in a number of ways. We have a couple of categories, basically open and closed. Basically, it's the same thing like if you've ever broken a bone. It's either an open fracture or a closed fracture. Closed head injury is where there is injury to the brain, but there hasn't been any breach of the skull, the cranium per se. This can be either a major concussion or traumatic injury that causes bleeding, or something that we're seeing a lot is we're seeing the increase in prevalence of CTE, which is basically the micro concussions, and that's why people are worried about people playing soccer, playing American football, playing some other heavy contact sports that are basically getting a lot of micro concussions that over time can affect the brain's ability to function properly and can lead to a whole slew of problems. Now, the second category is open head injuries, where there's actually some sort of breach of the cranium. Okay, like for an open fracture, there's a breach of the skin, which is a protective layer, by the bone that's broken. Okay, so an open head injury could be by some sort of accident of any number of sorts. Okay, but what happens is there's a breach of the cranium, and also, equally as important, a breach of the blood-brain barrier. You can Google that if you want. It's a specific kind of part of the brain that helps keep, infection and things of that out. It's basically for safety, and if that gets breached, that can be really bad for a person's health and safety. Now, when we're talking about characteristics of severe and profound, it's very, very hard to actually operationalize those, because we have to ask ourselves, what is the context in which what is the context of the disability in which there is a severe grade of intensity. So a person with a severe intellectual disability may have a hard time communicating, may not be able to communicate, may not, just because they don't have vocabulary, we may have issues with fine and gross motor skills, basic self-care types of things. Now, on the other hand, we can have a person with a relatively severe learning disability or even severe emotional and behavioral disability. Both of those could still be perceived as invisible disabilities, whereas someone just walking down, the corridor at the mall looks at somebody and they wouldn't be able to tell one way or the other unless the person is actually manifesting symptoms of said disability. For example, EBD having a meltdown or something like that. So it's not always so easy to characterize what a severe disability looks like. You really have to go back to the individual disability and understand that severe is just a gradient of intensity from mild to profound. But that the symptoms and the characteristics of that specific disability will be present at a very high degree of severity and intensity. Let's say for EBD or autism, you're talking about impulse control or something, or stereotypic behavior. It could be something that's a very minor tic, that's a mild disability, to very wild, it could be like extreme self-harm, extreme, dangerous harm-inflicting behavior, extreme aggression. There's a big difference between being a little bit annoyed, that your Taco Bell took a little bit too long to get out, and being, literally seeing red and, committing acts of aggression and violence against others for the same reason. Okay, yeah, being annoyed, that's a very mild reaction to it, and going on a rampage is a very severe reaction. So just take that with a grain of salt, and that's kind of how we need to characterize the idea of what a severe disability is, by going back to the root of what the disability is at heart. Now, as we said, these are low incidence disabilities. That means they don't occur a lot, right? So there's a low incidence of the disabilities. So looking at literally less than 1% to 1% of students in schools are going to be with this specific label. And some of these are extremely rare. Like the book says, that there's only 1,000 students total in the whole United States who are deafblind. Right now, I know people at the Indiana School for the Blind and Visually Impaired. There's only one student at that school of over 100 students that has the deafblind label. And then also you can see that traumatic brain injury, well, it is significantly higher compared to deafblind, 26,000 in a school system where we literally are educating tens of millions of children. It is kind of a literal drop in the bucket. So something that's very rare, and especially for you dual majors out there, not going to be something that you're going to see a whole lot of, because we see more incidences of TBI the older that students get, and we see a major jump or spike, if you will, once these students start to reach adolescence, because they start to participate in more high-risk behaviors. That can be more high-level sports. It could be start to drive and get in accidents through there, ATV accidents, all that sort of thing. As far as causes, just like the characteristics, understand that it's not what causes a severe disability. We need to understand what causes this disability in and of itself. What causes a disability could cause a mild disability, or it could cause a severe profound disability. It could be the same risk factors, but they manifest themselves at a different degree of intensity based on the student, based on other circumstances. So just take that with a grain of salt and understand that there is not and there's no one-size-fits-all cause for severe or profound disabilities. But also understand, at least for TBI is concerned, the causes are usually environmental through accident, but there are some how we call medical conditions that can cause traumatic brain injury. The example I gave earlier was meningitis, where you basically have a swelling of the brain, for lack of a better, of the meningia. Okay, so the brain swells and it starts to press against the cranium, or the skull, and that causes damage. Okay, so it doesn't always have to be accident related. It could potentially be health related as well. Now, as far as curricular needs are concerned, once again, we need to go back to the root of the individual disability categories and really find that information out from the specific disability categories. For students, especially with more intellectual related disabilities, We definitely need to work on modifying curriculum. Grade level curriculum, for the most part, is not going to be an option for students with severe intellectual disabilities. That's going to include a lot of functional performance, a lot of life skills, a lot of self-care, and independent living skills as they get older. But also understand that functional skills can include academic standards. For example, reading Shakespeare is an academic skill. Being able to read your address is a functional skill. Okay, so understand that reading can play and it can wear both of those hats depending on the context of the lesson and the objective of your lesson and what you're actually trying to do. So just take that in mind. For many students with severe disabilities, intellectual, communication, autism, deafblind, otherwise, we're going to see a much higher usage of the alternative communication devices, and those take a bunch of different forms, and you've already seen these in class a bunch of times, between PECs, between overlay maker. Basically, you have pictures with words so that the student can associate either a want, a need, a request, whatever, with a specific picture, yes, no, the things that they want to do, eat, sleep, bathroom. You can create boards where they can either point or nowadays the board can actually speak for the actual person. Even for students with very poor gross motor skills, technology is getting better to the point where we can now use eye movement and track eye movement on a specific communication board. Also, we do have facilitated communication, which is another thing that's kind of controversial in special education. There's a lot of professionals that both agree and disagree with its effectiveness as a thing. Basically, facilitated communication is where you have a communication board out, and for students who are unable to actually point or use the board, the facilitator helps either guide the student's hand or in some way assist the student in using the communication device so that they can communicate better. Now, as far as for deafblind, the one thing that I want you to take away is that we do have special communication methods for the deafblind. Understand that sign language would not be an option because of the blindness. Traditional sign language, because you could sign at a particular person and they wouldn't be able to see the signs to be able to utilize that. Now, that being said, we do use sign language, and we use basically a modified form of it for deafblind students, and it's called, you can Google this if you'd like, it's called Pro Tactile ASL. And there is actually a viral video that just went out. At this point, it's October 31st, 2018. There's a viral video on Facebook that had a Starbucks worker using Pro Tactile with a deafblind customer. And it's basically where the person will hold the hand out and the person will do a certain set of rhythmic tapping, if you will, and the combination of the tapping with fingers are going to basically equate to the symbol or the words, and that will be the form of communication. And there's some other forms of communication as well, signing into a person's hand, or doing like embossing, if you will, or engraving with your finger into a person's palm, finger spelling and letter spelling and things like that. So there are actually quite a few options that we have for students that are deafblind to achieve functional communication. Now, placement. Now, as far as severe disabilities are concerned, severe and profound disabilities, the majority of students with severe and profound disabilities are going to need some extra help, a lot of extra help. Okay, so you see that we don't have a very high rate of general ed inclusion. That's okay, but that also being said, many students with severe and profound disabilities can participate with their and should participate with their age peers in non-curricular activities. They can go to specials very often. They can definitely go to like lunch and recess, school, extracurricular types of things like, musical or a play or something like that. And this is actually really important, that we utilize every option that we can to help at least socially mainstream students, because once again, we're trying to provide appropriate academic supports, but we're also trying to provide the least restrictive environment. So for things like lunch, recess, specials, extracurriculars, and otherwise, you're going to have a much harder time justifying why that student can't participate with their non-disabled peers in those activities, because they get, with support anyways. So that being said, one thing to take away from multiple disabilities is not to necessarily lump in, well, and even with some cases of profound, it's really important that we don't lump in too many people together and make overgeneralizations. Let's say, for example, a person who's profoundly blind or a person who's profoundly deaf can absolutely 100% succeed in the general education environment. They're able to intellectually and through information processing take in material, but the issue is that they have a profound hearing loss or they have profound vision loss. It's still a profound disability. They may have no light reception because they have prosthetics. They had a tumor and they had cancer. They had to get their eye removed or had an accident, as opposed to someone who can at least see lights, shapes, and shadows and things like that. So, like I said, be careful when we're thinking about capabilities of students, even with a severe or a profound diagnoses, because it's not necessarily always telling. Let's say, for example, someone even with severe ADD, ADHD could potentially be extremely successful in the general education classroom given the proper resources and given the proper supports. Now, not always the case, no, but in some cases, yes. So just be careful when you're trying to make default judgments about people based on a categorization. That's a very slippery slope. So at any rate, I just wanted to go over a few of these main topics with you guys. Just understand that when we're talking about multiple disabilities, that could be a combination of any of the two, and that severe usually in practice deals with more intellectual or learning related disabilities, where profound is can be more about sensory, but profound is still definitely used, especially with intellectual disabilities, because we have a whole category and IQ range that we consider profound vision loss or a profound intellectual disability, and also the functional understanding of a chronological age of 2 or under. For a student in school, that's a pretty profound deficit. And then also understand just the TBI is something that's acquired. Do not mistake TBI for an intellectual disability, because ID has to happen early in life during developmental period, whereas TBI happens later, considered after, kind of after the developmental period. And understand the idea that we use alternative communication for many students that have a hard time verbalizing or communicating using verbal symbol sets, including those who are deafblind. We have things like protactile and other sorts of modified sign and braille type of symbol sets and communication methods for them. So understand that there's many options out there. Okay, well, thanks for taking a listen to this, and I will see you next time.